Hello, my name is Dietmar and I am a certified business consultant with Valiantys, and we are the largest Atlassian consultancy strictly focused on the Atlassian ecosystem. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today, I want to demystify screens and forms in Jira Service Management. Now, let's start with a humble pie picture. It's almost Halloween. It's the time where we definitely eat a lot of pie. And for me, it's also a time where I need to eat some humble pie. And this really is because of the fact that even as someone who focuses on Atlassian consulting and who is in Jira and Jira Service Management every day, all day long, I always learn something new. And sometimes as a consultant, I get stumped and then it really takes some time to figure out how things work in Jira and Jira Service Management because there are just so many configuration elements that come into play. So with that, I want to share what I learned configuring a service desk portal for a client this week. And I want to focus on the topics that you see on the screen, namely, how do you properly set up screens, screen schemes, and then of course issue type screen schemes, and how does this also work in relation to the request type editor, where you can set up request type editor forms, and you can also set up so-called dynamic portal forms. And then how does this actually work when you configure screens, portal forms, and request type editor forms in various screen operations when the agent creates an issue or when the agent receives an issue that was submitted by a customer on the portal. So with that, let's jump in. Now, before we get into the Jira Service Management application, it's really important to talk about some JSM data mapping topics. What you see on this screen is at the top, I want to talk about the various configuration elements that come into play. And then at the bottom, I want to talk about how that data is then actually used by both customers and agents. So let's talk about the configuration elements first. Now, as you probably know from Jira and Jira Service Management, fields always live on screens, and screens are highly configurable, and you can certainly set up custom fields that live on screens. Now, screens and fields need to then be stitched together in so-called screen schemes and so-called field schemes, or more accurately named field configuration schemes. But you actually need to then map those screen and field configurations via so-called issue type screen schemes. That's a mouthful. And field configuration schemes into the project. So important to know what we always emphasize in our Jira and Jira Service Management bootcamps that we teach is unless screens being placed in an issue type screen scheme where you really tell a screen what issue type it applies to, and the same for fields, they really have no meaning unless they're being mapped into a Jira Service Management project. That mapping of schemes into the project is really important. Now, the special thing about Jira Service Management, of course, is that you can get much more granular with so-called request types. And request types are a very elegant way which allows a customer from a portal to specify what type of request they want to submit. So request types, as you probably know, can also be further broken down or organized. It's a better way to say it, along so-called portal groups. Now, important to know is that request types always map to issue types, and it's issue types that control the fields that that request type applies to, the workflows that this issue that's created from the request type is being followed. And issue types, of course, use so-called issue type schemes, and issue type schemes also need to be mapped to the JSM project. Now, what is specific or interesting about the request type is that inside the request type editor, you can configure a request type form. So inside the request type editor, and I will show all of this in the system in a moment, you can set up a request type form with fields. And yes, on that form, you can place both system fields and custom fields. Now, of course, request types live in the JSM project. Now, request types are always mapped to, if you choose to create one, so-called portal forms. Now, a portal form is another type of form that can be optionally used in addition to, on top of, the request type form. And the nice thing about portal forms is that they are highly configurable. For example, you can create dynamic forms. That's why we sometimes call them dynamic forms, which allow you, for example, to control the behavior of certain fields depending on the value on another field. We call this dynamic form sections. Now, whereas the request type form was natively um, created by Atlassian, portal forms is actually technology that Atlassian acquired from a company called Proforma, and then they incorporate those portal forms. In JSM, it's simply called forms into JSM. So important to know here is that you have a request type form and so-called portal forms, or in JSM they're just called forms, but both of them can be used, and if you have both, they actually used in conjunction of each other. Now these are the various configuration elements that come into play. Now let's look at the use of those screens, fields, and forms, both from the customer and the agent perspective. Let's start with the customer. Of course, the customer goes to a portal, and on the portal, they submit a form. Now that form that they submit on the portal can be just a request type form, but if you have a portal form created as well, and that portal form is mapped to the request type, then the customer will see on the portal both the fields from the request type form and the dynamic form. They will see both. Now, once a customer submits a request on the portal, a JSM issue is created, and of course that JSM issue lives in the JSM project. And then the agent interacts with that issue that is created by the customer from the portal via so-called edit and view screen operations. Now let's look at the agent. Of course, the agent can also create issues from what we call the backend view through the create screen issue creation, right? That's where they can create an issue. For example, if an issue is being taken via phone call, the agent can then plug in that issue via the create screen issue operation. In which case it then of course also creates an issue, and once the issue is created, of course the issue can be edited and or viewed by privileged permissioned agents. Now, the interesting thing that I zoomed in on as I was configuring for a client this week is that the agent really has two options when they create an issue in JSM using a request type. They can opt to use the request type form fields. Again, the request type form fields, which is this form that I show up here, and they can use the screen scheme fields, so they have both options. Now I know this was a lot of information, so let's jump into the JSM application and I will demonstrate how all those elements fit together. So I'm now in a JSM bootcamp instance. I am teaching regularly every month Jira Service Management bootcamps. It's a 2-day class. We highly recommend that you attend. We cover anything related to Jira Service Management. And in that bootcamp instance, I spun up a fictitious service desk for a bike shop. I call it my bike shop service desk. So let's open up this project. Now this project opens up and there are now some configuration elements that we need to look at. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go to project settings. And in project settings, let's look at the issue types first. Now I created a service desk project here, obviously, and it is a Jira Service Management project type, and it uses out of the box those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 issue types. Incidents, service requests with and without approval, tasks and subtasks. And as you can see here, each issue type is mapped to a workflow, a field configuration, and screens, right? So that is the first configuration element that we need to point out. Now let's look at request types. Request types in my project, because I have enabled service request management, incident management, I have not enabled problem management and change management in this test project. So the work categories are service requests and incidents. So let's look at service requests. Here I have a service request called order a new bike. That request type, order a new bike, is mapped to the issue type. And it's the issue type that determines the workflow and the field, the screen behavior, right? So that is really the mapping that I showed on the PowerPoint slide earlier. The request type is mapped always to an issue type, but it's the issue type that controls workflow and screen behavior. Now I created also an incident um, uh, request type, and I call it report the problem with your bike. And that incident request type with a request type description, which of course you can customize, is mapped to the incident issue type. And the incident issue type controls workflow and field behavior. Now let's look at that system incident request type a little bit closer. I'm now opening that request type. And now in that request type editor, I have the request form. Now in that form, I can now determine which fields are being used on that form. I can add any system field and any custom field to that form, right? So this is the request type editor form that always comes with Jira. The request type editor form is customizable, but what you cannot do is you cannot create dynamic behavior on that form. It's pretty static. Now let's look at the service request and let's look at order a new bike. Let's look at that request type. On that request type, I added a few custom fields. Bike color choice, new bike due date, bike size. Those are custom fields that I created, and I added those fields to the request type form. Now, the second form that I mentioned earlier is that dynamic form. I refer to it as a portal form because it is typically used by a customer on the portal. So I'm navigating from project settings to forms. And I created a Dietmar Bike Shop bike ordering form. Let's look at that form. Now that is a so-called dynamic form. On that form, I have fields. And for example, I added a field called bike brand, and that field is not mapped to a Jira field. So it's really just a label with label choices. Of course, the data is stored on the database, but because it's not mapped to a Jira field, you cannot run automations against it. You cannot run reports against it. You cannot write a JQL against it. For example, you could not filter against a portal form only field in a query in your GSM project. Okay. Now, the form needs to be mapped to a request type. And in this case, I map the form to request type order a new bike. Now, of course, a form can be mapped to multiple, not only one request type. All right, now the last thing that we need to look at is the screens that are mapped via screen schemes, issue type screen schemes into this project. So from project settings, the easiest way to look into this is to click on summary. Summary is a really great way to get a summary of all the schemes mapped into your project. So I'm looking in the summary screen and I'm coming down to screens. And I created a screen scheme called Dietmar Bike Help Desk Issue Type Screen Scheme. So it's an issue type screen scheme. I'm looking up at the screen scheme, and here I say that for each of the issue types in my project, I am determining which screens should be used by each of those issue types. So if it is a system service request with or without approval and a subtask, it should go to the Dietmar Bike Help Desk screen scheme. If it is a service, an incident, it should go to that scheme. So let's look at the incident, for example. The incident issue type is mapped to, for the create, edit, and view operation, to those three different screens. So as I showed on the slide deck earlier, we have now completed the walkthrough of all the configuration elements before I can demo this. So we had screens with fields that are mapped to the project via screen and field schemes and issue type screen schemes and field configuration schemes. We have request types that are organized in portal groups. They are mapped to issue types and via an issue type scheme that's mapped back into the project. We talked about the request type form, where you can add both custom and system fields. And we talked about dynamic forms, or so-called portal forms. JSM just calls it forms, that also live in the project, and they are mapped to one or multiple issue request types. So without any further ado, let's test it out and look at how all of those elements come together when first a customer uses that project submitting a request from the portal. So they're submitting a request from the portal, it should create a JSM issue, and then the agent deals with it. And then lastly, how the behavior is from a screen perspective when an agent creates an issue via create screen operations on the backend, not from the portal. So I navigated to the so-called help center. As you know, portals, there can be many portals in an organization. We work with global clients that have 80 different portals globally. Of course, there are permission concepts where customers would only see the portals that they are part of and that are relevant for them. So in this case, I navigated to my GSM Bootcamp Help Center, and on that Help Center, I have a portal called Dietmar Bike Shop Service Desk. Welcome, you can raise a request for Dietmar's Bike Shop here. We're here to sell you the best bikes in the world. Let's go into this portal. I open this portal up and I have organized my request types along so-called portal groups. And I want to order a new bike. So I'm selecting the request type, which on the back end is mapped to an issue type, which controls screen and field behavior. So I'm selecting the bike order request type, order a new bike. Now, what's happening here is it's bringing up the portal form, right? So the portal form that I created earlier is now being brought up. So let me just populate this form and then I come back and then we submit it. So the customer has now filled out a pretty comprehensive form on the portal. So we have various fields that I created here. So what you see here on this form is that the top of the form, the first few fields, raise this request on behalf of, summary, are fields that actually come from the request type form. So this is really important to point out. The form that the customer sees on the portal is always a combination of the fields from the request type form plus, if you have one, additional fields from the so-called portal form or form. So in this case, the first few fields, raise this request on behalf of, summary, are fields from the request type editor form. And then the other fields here tell us why you need a new bike, bike color, new bike date, etc. with some attachments. Those are fields that come from that dynamic form or portal form. So the customer has submitted this. We are ready to submit the request to the service desk. And it has now created Dietmar Bike Shop ticket number 1. So let's look at this field, at this ticket from the agent perspective. So I'm now back to my slide deck here. We created the form, the issue, or the form from the portal. It created the issue, and now I'm going into edit and view screen operations as the agent. That's what I'm doing right now. So back to the portal. So I'm going from the portal now, pretending that I'm an agent, right into the issue DBS1, and it created the issue in that Dietmar Bike Shop Service Desk project. Now, what you see here is, first of all, it uploaded the attachments that the customer submitted on the portal, and you see the form that the customer submitted attached to the ticket, to the issue. So it's embedded, and that form can be downloaded, for example, as a PDF, and then you can email it off. Now, what you see, all the other fields that you see on this screen now is determined from the screen scheme that is mapped to the issue type, which is mapped to the request type. And I'm currently in the edit and view screen operation. So what you see here, the fields that you see here on the right side specifically, are fields that come from the issue, from the screen that is mapped to the issue type. That is the key that we need to keep in mind here. Now, the last thing in this video that I want to demonstrate is the behavior when an agent, so a service desk team member, creates an issue from the issue create screen. Not a customer from the portal, but the agent creates the issue from the create issue screen. Because there are some interesting options here that I want to point out here, where the agent can either use the request type form fields or the screen scheme fields. So let's look at this, how this works. So I'm going right directly into my project, and I'm hitting the create button. Now I'm creating an issue. So in Jira Service Management, of course, we always in the create screen have to say what is the issue type. The issue type is always a mandatory field in Jira and Jira Service Management. You can never have an issue without an issue type. So I'm selecting, in this case, a service request without approvals, right? I'm ordering a new bike. Let's just say it does not need approvals. And then I'm selecting the request type that is available or mapped to the issue type service request. Now I'm selecting the order a new bike, the same request type that the customer in my previous example used from the portal. Now, here is this interesting toggle that I want to point out. And this is humble pie that got me when I was actually building this for one of my wonderful clients. Now, when you create as an agent a new issue, by default, it says use request type fields. So in other words, it's now bringing the fields up that are present in the request type form, right? Not the portal form, the request type form, right? So it is now bringing up not the portal form fields. It's not bringing up the fields that are mapped to the create issue screen. It's actually only bringing up the fields that I have on the request type editor, right? So this is what really got me, because I was expecting in the create issue operation that it would bring up the fields from the create issue screen. That is not the case, because the toggle is turned on here to use the request type only fields, and they are definitely not the same as the create issue screen operation. However, when and very limited fields here, right? We have bike size, new bike due date, bike color. You see that those fields are also different from the portal form fields that I demonstrated in the customer role persona earlier. But as soon as I toggle this use request type fields off, it's now showing different fields, and it's showing fields that are just not the same fields that what I have in the request type editor. So this toggle on and off is a very key difference in the experience that the agent has when they create an issue. So let's toggle it on again. And when you toggle it on, meaning use request type fields, a warning message comes up. This request type includes a form that can't be seen in this view. All right. So it basically presents a little warning to the agent. Agent, be careful. You are now limiting yourself to request type only fields, right? There are additional fields that we have available on a portal form because that portal form is mapped to the request type that you have selected. So it's a warning that comes up, and it presents the agent with a nice little link where the agent can now go directly to the portal. And if they do that, they are presented with the same form that the customer submits. Agents can submit requests on the portal just as the customer does, and in doing so, it allows them, on behalf of the customer, I suppose, to fill out all those fields. And then when they do that, the form that is then submitted from the portal is, of course, added to that issue in the GSM ticket. So this is the gotcha, the humble pie learning that I wanted to pass on to you. It's fairly complicated to configure all those elements. What we as Jira and Jira Service Management consultants very often at administrators find is there are a myriad of configuration elements that come together. And that is because Jira Service Management, of course, also Confluence are so highly configurable. There are so many options that you can build out. And this is why it sometimes really takes some thinking and writing it down how you actually configure all those elements. I hope that you found this video informative. I certainly learned a lot myself as I was building this out. Um, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. My name again is Dietmar. I am a business consultant with Valiantys. If you need our help, please contact us, reach out to us. We would be delighted to work with you. Thank you again for having joined me today. Hopefully this was helpful for you. I wish you a great day and happy Atlassian journeys. Thank you.